bias is pretty prevalent in people. So much so that I would say it's not really something you can get rid of. This is an especially relevant topic for therapists or anyone going to therapy. Part of the process is that we're not supposed to be biased as therapists, and people want to go to a therapist that is unbiased, but I will argue that it's just not possible. Not to the fullest extent, in that a better approach there is to recognize the bias that you already have. So one of the most impactful things that I have learned or realized that has helped me understand statistics and studies and people was actually a true statement made to be, both truthful and a joke, which are some of the most fun statements. And that's this: that every survey is biased towards people willing to take a survey. So we talked about how do we make an unbiased assessment. People look at this with political polls. How do we predict things properly? How do we properly assess a demographic or a location or a community without having to ask every single person? And the reality, and there's lots of jokes around about this, and I think jokes are such a fantastic way to understand truth, but people think about, how do I make my survey better and better and better, that it eliminates any potential bias or eliminates anything that we were maybe scared that would get in the way. And the reality is you can't, because every survey is biased towards someone willing to take it. Stop someone on the side of the road. If you send an email, there are certain people who will accept that and who will deny it. And the hidden question in there is, are there similarities between the people who won't take them? And a step deeper, are those similarities enough that they represent their own demographic? So, what are things that entire people groups and communities will avoid? And yes, some of that could be generalizations or stereotypes, but not all of them. I don't think I'm going to attempt to get into what some examples of that might be. And frankly, I don't have any immediate ones that come to mind. But to know that there's always a certain type of bias, and to think about, if you do an assessment on healthy eating, and you do a survey about that, and the survey is sent to everyone at your local gym, okay, the bias is already set, especially if in your results you say this is what people on average eat. And that's not true. That's what people on average at your gym eat. And so the question is, how much data do you have to collect before you can extrapolate to a larger group? So, if I interviewed, say you go to Planet Fitness, it'd be just that Planet Fitness. But what if I interviewed, 10 Planet Fitnesses in the Kansas City metro? Well, can I say this is what people eat? No, I can only say this is what people eat on average at Planet Fitness, or rather, this is what people who attend Planet Fitness in the KC metro typically eat in their standard diet. I have to put those restrictions because it's just not true for everyone. This is why we have demographics. And this is where the conversation of intersectionality gets very difficult, because at what point do you continue or stop subdividing people? Because at the end of the day, we all become individuals again. This is a big issue with getting into group identity, and that type of identity politics is, where do you draw a line? And it will eventually be arbitrary for that. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be helpful. If we're looking at customs of Americans versus customs of people living in Mozambique, yeah, we can generalize a little bit. And it's because what we're looking at is Americans versus citizens of Mozambique. And so it just comes down to, what are you trying to figure out and what factors are relevant there. So, surveys are biased towards people willing to take a survey. That is extremely relevant if you're trying to conduct a survey or collect data on how willing people are to take time out of their day to do something for a stranger. is that already biased based on the people that are willing to take time for that interview? I think it's just worth considering. So anytime you look at any data, it's really important to look at the group that they picked from. And you don't have to be an expert on understanding statistics and data, but is the pool of people big enough? Are there people who might have gotten missed? Look at the most recent political polls, the last 3 elections. They're just wrong. And they're going to be because they don't ask everyone. But the question is, if they're wrong, what are they missing? If your data predicts poorly, what is missing? And this is why tracking that data across time is helpful. If I'm not mistaken, weather forecasts are pretty accurate. So you get a prediction 90% chance of rain. And you hear that forecast over the course of 2 weeks, the meteorologist says we have a 90% chance of rain tomorrow. 10 different times. So over 2 weeks, 10 out of those 14 days, the meteorologist predicts a 90% chance of rain. If it rains 9 of those times, then the meteorologist was correct. It rained 90% of the time that they said 90% chance. So it's actually correct. Now if they say there's a 90% chance of rain tomorrow and then it doesn't rain, you might think they were wrong. Not necessarily. It didn't happen that day. But if that day was wrong and then the next 9 are correct, then it was accurate, because the 90% is the running average of that situation, which is why we also need enough data that represents that. So just 10 predictions isn't enough, because if one of them is skewed or an outlier, it doesn't fit. That's why if you poll 100,000 people about who they're going to vote for, that's not a huge percentage of people when you take into account that about 150 million people voted in the most recent national election. So 150 million, and you interviewed 100,000 people. And then that's a question of representation. So did you only interview white people living in San Francisco? Because that's going to be skewed. Were there 18-year-olds in there? Were there 70-year-olds? Black Americans, white Americans, Asian Americans, men, women, all these different subcategories, different cities. Did you interview people that come from 40-person towns? So at a certain point, you just haven't asked enough people. There's a joke, and I forget the show. I'm pretty sure my wife was telling it to me, and I love it, but the person, they're tracking political stuff, and the person came to their friend and they said, hey, my polls that I did says that you're going to win the election, the local election, with a 100% chance. And they said, 100% chance, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, I looked at the national polling average and how many people get polled compared to the population. And then I took that as a percentage and looked at our town, and that same representation percentage-wise means as long as we ask one person, that's going to be an accurate representation. And I asked myself, and I'm going to vote for you, so you have a 100% chance of winning. And so they just reversed that. So whatever, that percentage would have equated to. And logically, it makes sense. But we know that that's not enough information. So just a fun thing to remember. Surveys are biased towards people willing to take a survey. Do with that what you will.